The scorching Texas sun beat down on 18-year-old Lucas "Mule Boy" Patterson as he guided the stubborn pack animals through the dusty streets of Harmony Creek, their hooves kicking up small clouds of dirt that hung in the still air like ghosts of better days. The nickname had followed him since childhood, bestowed by cruel tongues when he was just 8 years old, and assigned to work with the town's mule train after his parents died in a cholera outbreak. Lucas had the lean, weathered appearance of someone who had spent their entire life in hard labor under an unforgiving sun. His clothes were patched and worn, his boots held together more by hope than leather, and his hands bore the calluses and scars of a decade spent handling ornery pack animals that had injured better men. But his eyes, despite years of mockery and hardship, still held a spark of dignity that no amount of cruelty had managed to extinguish. "Make way for Mule Boy," called out Samuel Garrett, the banker's son, from the porch of his father's establishment. His companions, a group of young men whose wealth and privilege had shielded them from any real hardship, erupted in laughter at the familiar taunt. "Hope those mules don't kick any sense into you today, though I suppose that would require you having a brain to damage." The mockery was so routine that Lucas barely registered it anymore, though the sting of social rejection never fully faded. He had been Mule Boy for so long that some younger residents of Harmony Creek didn't even know his real name. The label had become his identity, defining him in the eyes of a community that judged worth by social standing rather than character. Lucas's employer, Hiram Jenkins, operated the town's freight and pack train service, moving goods between Harmony Creek and the surrounding ranches and settlements. The work was demanding and poorly paid, but it had given Lucas a roof over his head and just enough money to survive. More importantly, it had taught him the value of the land itself, as he traversed countless miles of Texas prairie and learned to read the subtle signs that distinguished good grazing territory from worthless scrub. What the townspeople didn't know, because they had never bothered to look beyond the surface of the dirty mule handler, was that Lucas had spent his spare time educating himself through books borrowed from the town's small library and careful observation of the ranching operations he encountered during his travels. He understood cattle breeding, water management, land assessment, and the complex economics of frontier agriculture better than most of the privileged young men who mocked him. The one person in Harmony Creek who had seen past Lucas's social status was Jacob "Old Jake" Montgomery, a reclusive rancher who owned 200 acres of prime grazing land about 10 miles outside town. Montgomery was a gruff, taciturn man in his 70s, who had homesteaded his property 40 years earlier and built it into a modest but profitable operation through sheer determination and careful management. Lucas had first encountered Old Jake 5 years earlier when delivering supplies to the Montgomery ranch. The old rancher had been struggling to repair a collapsed section of his barn, and Lucas had volunteered to help despite having other deliveries to make. The assistance had been offered without expectation of reward or recognition, simply because it was the right thing to do. "You're the one they call Mule Boy," Jake had observed, as they worked together to restore the damaged structure. It was a statement rather than a question, delivered without the mockery that usually accompanied the nickname. "Yes, sir," Lucas had replied simply. Though my given name is Lucas Patterson, Jake had studied him with eyes that seemed to see more than most people bothered to look for. "Names are funny things, son. Some folks earn them through deeds, others have them thrust upon by circumstances, and the rest inherit them from their ancestors. What matters is what you do with the name you've got." That conversation had been the beginning of an unlikely friendship between the elderly rancher and the young mule handler. Over the following years, Lucas had made a point of stopping at Montgomery's ranch whenever his freight routes brought him nearby, always offering to help with whatever repairs or chores needed attention. Jake, in turn, had shared his extensive knowledge of ranching, teaching Lucas everything from how to judge cattle quality to the best methods for managing prairie grass and water resources. Most people in town think you're stupid because you work with mules, Jake had told Lucas during one of their many conversations. But I've watched you handle those animals, and I've seen how smart you are about reading their moods and anticipating their behavior. That takes intelligence that book learning can't teach. The old rancher's validation had meant more to Lucas than any amount of acceptance from the townspeople who dismissed him as worthless. Jake Montgomery treated him as an equal, valued his opinions, and never once called him Mule Boy, except when specifically referencing how others viewed him. "You know what I see when I look at you?" Jake had asked during their most recent conversation, just 2 weeks before the events that would transform Lucas's life forever. "I see a young man who's been tested by hardship and hasn't broken. I see someone who works hard without complaining, who helps others without expecting reward, and who's smart enough to educate himself despite having no advantages." Lucas had been embarrassed by the praise, unused to hearing anything positive about himself from anyone. "I appreciate that, Mr. Montgomery, but I'm just doing what I can to get by." "That's exactly my point," Jake had replied with a knowing smile. "You've got humility along with intelligence and work ethic. That's a rare combination, especially out here where pride often matters more than sense." Now, as Lucas guided his mules through Harmony Creek while enduring another round of mockery from Samuel Garrett and his friends, he found himself thinking about old Jake's words and wondering why the old rancher hadn't been seen in town for several days. Jake had been showing signs of declining health during their recent conversations, moving more slowly and breathing with obvious difficulty. But he had refused to see a doctor or admit that anything was seriously wrong. Lucas's concern deepened when he passed Dr. William Harrison's office and saw the physician emerging with a grim expression that suggested he had just delivered bad news to someone. The doctor's eyes met Lucas's for a brief moment, and something in that glance made Lucas's stomach tighten with premonition. "Dr. Harrison!" Lucas called out, bringing his mules to a halt. "Is everything all right?" The physician hesitated before responding, clearly debating how much information to share with someone he probably considered just a mule handler. "I've just come from the Montgomery Ranch, Lucas. I'm afraid Jake suffered a heart attack last night. He passed away peacefully in his sleep." The news hit Lucas like a physical blow, stealing his breath and making his vision blur with sudden tears. Well, Jake had been more than just a friend. He had been the only person in Harmony Creek who treated Lucas like a human being deserving of respect and consideration. "I'm sorry for your loss," Dr. Harrison continued, his tone softening as he recognized genuine grief in the young man's expression. "I know Jake valued your friendship. He mentioned you often during my recent visits." Lucas struggled to find words adequate to express what he was feeling, but before he could formulate a response, the doctor added something that would change everything. "Judge Morrison wants to see you at the courthouse tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Something about Jake's will." The Harmony Creek Courthouse was an imposing 2-story brick building that represented the law and order that supposedly governed frontier justice. Lucas had never been inside before, and his entrance the following morning drew curious stares from the clerks and lawyers who populated the building's halls. A mule handler had no business in such refined surroundings, and his worn clothes and work-hardened hands marked him as someone clearly out of place. Judge Theodore Morrison's chambers were located on the 2nd floor, accessed through a heavy oak door that bore the judge's name in gold lettering. Lucas knocked hesitantly, half expecting to be told that some mistake had been made and that he shouldn't have come. "Enter," called a deep voice from within, and Lucas pushed through the door to find himself in a book-lined office dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Judge Morrison sat behind this desk, a silver-haired man in his 60s whose stern features softened slightly as Lucas approached. "Mr. Patterson," the judge said, gesturing toward a leather chair positioned before the desk. "Please have a seat." "I appreciate your promptness." Lucas sat carefully, acutely aware of how his dirty work clothes contrasted with the room's refined elegance. Dr. Harrison said you wanted to see me about Mr. Montgomery's will. Your Honor, but I don't understand why I would be involved. Morrison studied Lucas with the careful attention of someone trained to evaluate character and credibility. Before we discuss the will, I want to ask you about your relationship with Jacob Montgomery. How long had you known him? About 5 years, sir, Lucas replied honestly. I met him when I was delivering supplies to his ranch, and we became friends after I helped him repair his barn. I tried to visit whenever my freight routes brought me nearby. And during these visits, did Mr. Montgomery ever discuss his property with you? Talk about his plans for the ranch after his death? Lucas shook his head. No, sir. We mostly talked about ranching in general, cattle management, that kind of thing. He taught me a lot about how to run a successful operation, but he never mentioned what would happen to his place after he was gone. The judge nodded, as if this answer confirmed something he had suspected. Mr. Patterson, I've been practicing law in Texas for 35 years, and in that time I've seen many wills that reflected the testator's desire to reward family members or business associates. But Jacob Montgomery's will is unique in my experience. Morrison opened a folder on his desk and withdrew several legal documents, their formal language and official seals marking them as important. Mr. Montgomery came to me 6 months ago to have his will drafted. He was very specific about his intentions and insisted that I follow his instructions precisely, regardless of any controversy they might cause. Lucas felt his pulse quickening as he sensed that something significant was about to be revealed. What did his will say, Your Honor? The will contains several small bequests to various charities and a few distant relatives, Morrison explained. But the bulk of his estate, including his 200 acres of ranch land, all livestock, equipment and buildings, has been left to you. For several seconds, Lucas couldn't process what he had just heard. The words seemed to echo in his mind without making sense, as if the judge had spoken in a foreign language that Lucas's brain was struggling to translate. That's impossible, Lucas finally managed to say. Why would Mr. Montgomery leave his ranch to me? I'm just a mule handler. Morrison's expression showed something that might have been respect or approval. Mr. Montgomery's will includes a letter explaining his decision. Would you like me to read it? Lucas nodded mutely, still trying to comprehend the magnitude of what the judge had just revealed. Morrison withdrew another document and began reading in a voice that seemed to carry old Jake's distinctive cadence. To whom it may concern, I write this letter to explain why I have chosen Lucas Patterson as my sole heir and beneficiary of my ranch and property. For 5 years, I have observed this young man's character through both his actions and his words. Despite being given the degrading nickname Mule Boy and subjected to constant mockery from people who should know better, Lucas has maintained his dignity and his work ethic. He has helped me countless times without asking for payment or recognition, always offering assistance simply because it was needed. More importantly, Lucas has demonstrated intelligence, curiosity, and a genuine love for the land that reminds me of my younger self. He understands that ranching is about stewardship rather than exploitation, about building something lasting rather than extracting quick profits. These qualities are rare, especially among young people who have been raised with privilege and never learned the value of hard work. I have no children of my own, and my distant relatives have shown no interest in my welfare during my lifetime. They will undoubtedly contest this will, claiming that I was mentally incompetent or that Lucas somehow manipulated me. I assure anyone reading this that I am of sound mind and that my decision is based on careful observation of character rather than sentiment or manipulation. Lucas Patterson deserves this. Inheritance because he will treat the land with respect, because he has proven himself worthy through years of honest labor, and because I believe he will build upon what I have created rather than squandering it. If my relatives object, they should consider whether their own actions have earned them any claim to my property. Lucas is about to inherit 200 acres. But will the town accept Mule Boy as a landowner? Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell to see how Lucas fights for his incredible inheritance. The news of Lucas Patterson's inheritance spread through Harmony Creek with the speed of a prairie wildfire, creating shockwaves that disrupted the town's carefully maintained social hierarchy. The mule handler, whom everyone had dismissed as worthless, was suddenly revealed as the owner of 200 prime acres, along with substantial livestock holdings and equipment that made him one of the more prosperous ranchers in the county. The reaction from the town's established families ranged from disbelief to outrage, with particular fury emanating from the Montgomery relatives who had expected to inherit Jake's property. Within days of the will's reading, 3 different family members had filed legal challenges, claiming that the old rancher had been mentally incompetent or that Lucas had fraudulently influenced him. The challenges came to a formal hearing 2 weeks later in Judge Morrison's courtroom, packed with spectators eager to witness the confrontation between established wealth and the upstart mule handler. Lucas sat at the defendant's table with a court-appointed lawyer, acutely aware that most people in the room expected him to be exposed as a fraud and stripped of his inheritance. The Montgomery family's chief representative was Harrison Montgomery, Jake's nephew from Dallas, whose expensive suit and polished manner marked him as someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. His lawyer, Martin Blackwell, was known throughout Texas as a skilled litigator who specialized in inheritance disputes. "Your Honor," Blackwell began with practiced eloquence, "we are here today to rectify a grave injustice perpetrated against the Montgomery family. My client's uncle was clearly suffering from diminished mental capacity when he drafted this absurd will, and we have substantial evidence that he was manipulated by the defendant." The lawyer spent an hour presenting testimony from various witnesses who claimed that Jake Montgomery had shown signs of confusion and poor judgment during his final months. Most of the testimony was vague and circumstantial, but it created an impression that the old rancher might not have been fully competent. "Furthermore," Blackwell continued, "we must consider the inherent absurdity of leaving valuable property to a mule handler rather than to one's own family. What possible reason would a rational person have for making such a decision?" Judge Morrison's expression remained neutral throughout the presentation, but Lucas noticed that the judge occasionally glanced at certain documents on his bench with what might have been satisfaction. When it came time for Lucas's defense, his court-appointed lawyer seemed nervous and unprepared, clearly outmatched by the experienced Blackwell. But before the lawyer could begin his opening statement, Judge Morrison interrupted with an unexpected announcement. "Before we proceed further," the judge said, "I want to introduce some evidence that was not available to either party before this hearing." Morrison produced a thick folder containing multiple documents, each one bearing official seals and signatures. "6 months ago, when Jacob Montgomery came to me to draft his will, I suggested that he undergo a complete medical and psychological evaluation to document his mental competency. He agreed, and these documents represent the findings of 3 independent physicians who examined him thoroughly." The judge began reading from the medical reports, which painted a clear picture of a man who was physically declining but mentally sharp. The doctors had tested Jake's memory, reasoning ability, and understanding of his own financial affairs, finding him completely competent in all respects. "Furthermore," Morrison continued, "Mr. Montgomery anticipated that his decision would be challenged, so he prepared additional documentation explaining his reasoning and providing evidence of the relationship between himself and Mr. Patterson." The judge produced a series of letters that Jake had written over the past 5 years, each one describing specific interactions with Lucas and explaining why he had come to value the young man's character. The letters were detailed, thoughtful, and demonstrated clear mental competency. "In this letter, dated 3 years ago," Morrison read, "Mr. Montgomery wrote, 'Lucas came by today to help me mend the south fence. He refused payment as usual, claiming that friendship doesn't require compensation. His understanding of land management continues to impress me. He notices things that most college-educated ranchers would miss. As the judge continued reading, a picture emerged of a deliberate, well-considered decision based on years of observation rather than impulsive favoritism or mental confusion. Jake Montgomery had carefully documented his reasoning, anticipating every objection that his relatives might raise. The most damning evidence against the family's claims came in the form of letters that Jake had written to his relatives over the years, inviting them to visit and showing interest in maintaining family relationships. The responses, or lack thereof, demonstrated clearly that the Montgomery family had shown no interest in Jake's welfare until after his death. "Your Honor," Harrison Montgomery finally interrupted, his composure cracking under the weight of the evidence. "Surely you don't expect us to believe that my uncle preferred a mule handler to his own blood relatives?" Judge Morrison's response was sharp and definitive. "What I expect, Mr. Montgomery, is that you and your relatives accept responsibility for your own choices. Your uncle reached out to you repeatedly over the years, and you ignored him until his death made his property valuable to you." The judge turned his attention to Lucas, his stern features softening slightly. "Mr. Patterson, I've reviewed all the evidence presented today, and I find no basis for overturning Jacob Montgomery's will. The property is yours, legitimately inherited from a man who valued your character over family obligation." As the courtroom erupted in whispered conversations, Samuel Garrett stood up from the spectator gallery. The banker's son, who had mocked Lucas for years, now looked embarrassed and uncertain. "Your Honor," Samuel said hesitantly, "I'd like to apologize to Lucas. I've called him Mule Boy for years, and I never bothered to learn anything about him beyond his job. That was wrong, and I'm sorry." The apology seemed to open floodgates, as several other young men who had participated in Lucas's mockery stepped forward to offer their own expressions of regret. Not all of them were sincere, but some showed genuine shame about their past behavior. In the weeks that followed, Lucas gradually adapted to his new role as a rancher and landowner. The transition was difficult, requiring him to learn new skills and overcome the social prejudices that persisted despite the legal validation of his inheritance. But the foundation that old Jake had provided through years of patient teaching served him well. Lucas hired Hiram Jenkins, his former employer, to help manage the mule operations that continued as part of the ranch's freight business. He also made a point of hiring other young people who had been dismissed or overlooked by Harmony Creek's established families, giving them the same kind of opportunity that Jake Montgomery had given him. "I spent 18 years being called Mule Boy," Lucas explained to a newspaper reporter who came to interview him about his remarkable transformation. "I learned that people's opinions about your worth often have nothing to do with your actual abilities or character. Mr. Montgomery saw past the nickname to recognize what I might become, and I intend to honor his faith in me by doing the same for others." The story of the mule handler who became a landowner spread throughout Texas, inspiring other young people who had been dismissed or marginalized by their communities. Lucas Patterson became a symbol of the frontier ideal that worth should be measured by character and ability rather than birth or social standing. The ranch itself flourished under Lucas's management, benefiting from both the practical knowledge he had gained through years of freight work and the ranching principles Jake had taught him. Within 5 years, the property's value had doubled, validating old Jake's judgment about his young friend's abilities. Most importantly, Lucas never forgot the lessons learned during his years as Mule Boy. He remained humble, hard-working, and committed to treating all people with the dignity that he himself had been denied for so long. The nickname that had once been a tool of mockery became a reminder of where he had come from, and why character mattered more than status. What an incredible journey from mockery to respect. Lucas proved that true worth comes from character, not circumstance. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell for more amazing tales of triumph, in the Old West. Share this inspiring story with everyone who believes in second chances and the power of perseverance. What was your favorite moment in Lucas's transformation from mule boy to respected rancher? Let us know in the comments below.